Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Oxford Net Zero's showcase event. I'm Myles, the Director Emeritus, we might say, or Founding Director, they politely put it, of Oxford Net Zero, and I've got the task of talking until the VC turns up. Which actually it's quite a familiar role for me, actually, and it is fairly nerve-wracking, but I'm sure she'll be here in about 10 minutes or so. And so I thought, but I was asked to give you a little bit of sort of the history of Oxford Net Zero, and tell you and sort of tell you a bit about where it came from and where we've got to now, because. I mean, net zero is going through, as a phrase, going through tough times. I think it's quite helpful for us to look back at where the concept came from in order that we can ask what we can do to sort of realign things with what was perhaps originally meant by the science. So I can tell you, if I know I've been tasked to give you the sort of short history of Oxford Net Zero, but since Irene's not here, I'm going to take the liberty of going back a little bit further to be precise, actually. I can tell you exactly where net zero came from, to the day, because it was Irene's birthday, 2014, and I was sitting on a stage in a large conference hall in Copenhagen, in the final plenary session of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's synthesis report. And this is, for those of you not familiar with the IPCC process, I know several people in the room are horribly familiar with the IPCC process, but having written the report, the scientists, the authors of the report, get grilled by the world's governments about the meaning of the phrases they use and the language they've used to make sure the report is providing a balanced and non-prescriptive overview of the state of the science at the time. And suddenly, one government, and it's a long time ago now, so I think I can tell you which one it was, although, you know, what happened in Copenhagen technically stays in Copenhagen, but government of Norway suddenly put up its placard and said, we'd like to insert the word net in front of the word zero in this sentence. And I can remember. And then suddenly other governments started putting their placards up as well. We hadn't responded to the initial suggestion. And we were sort of, you kind of cover the mic and huddle. And so we were huddling about this. And then suddenly lots of other placards saying, yeah, we found another zero we'd like to put in. Other governments started joining in. And I can remember, I was sitting next to Pierre Friedlingstein, one of the world's leading carbon cycle modelers. For those of you who know him, he's a wonderful guy. He's a sort of avuncular Belgian. And he said, well, it means the same thing. I said, I suppose it does, yeah. And then I remember exactly him saying this. He said, well, if it keeps them happy. And the thing is about these IPCC processes, it's all about deciding which fights you're going to pick. Because you can't fight every suggestion, and that's not the point. I mean, you don't want to build a sort of adversarial relationship between the authors of the report and the governments who ultimately own the report. And the reason the IPCC process has been a success is because we do have this collaborative approach to building a sort of common body of knowledge to work from. And so we let it go. And that, I can tell you very precisely, was when net zero as a phrase was born, for better or for worse. So sorry about that. Maybe we should have dug our heels in, I'm not sure. Because if you go back to the 6 papers that actually introduced the need for what we now call net zero emissions back in 2009, Pierre was an author on 2 of them, I was an author on a different 2, so we were both of us heavily involved in them. Nowhere in those papers does the phrase net zero appear. We just talk about zero emissions. But of course, you know, carbon cycle modeler or a physicist, we were just saying, well, you know, 1 apple minus 1 apple is no apples, you know, so what's the problem? Of course, notoriously, since then, we've having to deal with sort of 1 apple minus a banana, and you know, that is a problem. And so you know, maybe that's where, by introducing the net to net zero, we opened the option of apples minus bananas being defined as zero. And that, of course, has been a lot of the work of Oxford Net Zero, has been calling out that kind of nonsense. And a lot of the work of the Net Zero Tracker in particular, which is sort of one of the things we're really most proud of in Oxford Net Zero, is establishing what it is reasonable to net out and what is not. And in that Nature Climate Change paper that Sam led, which sort of launched the Oxford Net Zero project, and actually is one of our, I think it probably is our most highly cited paper, and it was a really good idea, the meaning of net zero and how to get it right, back in Nature Climate Change in 2021, and it was a very good idea because it meant that it forced us as a community to sort of both get together and think through what was important in net zero. And it introduced, I think for the first time, the phrase like-for-like balance, which has been picked up and is increasingly important, as in, well, it was always important, and it's increasingly getting a little bit of traction. So that's where the conversation, I think, is, making net zero work in the way that, such that Pierre and I were right to say, well, it doesn't really matter, it means the same thing. That's, I think, the challenge we face at the moment. I'm looking sort of slightly anxiously through the door to see if anybody's going to arrive, but they're not, so that's okay. I can get on to to Oxford Net Zero itself. So when we started Oxford Net Zero, it was, and many of you, those of you involved will recall, it was deep in COVID. I was spending my working life in the basement of 19 Merton Street. And of course, one of the first things we had to do was design a logo, because that's what projects do. You have to design a logo. And so that was, in terms of the first challenges for Oxford Net Zero. Oh yeah, we kind of knew what we wanted to do and wrote down the science and so on, but let's come up with a logo. So there's badges available if you haven't picked one up already. And I just thought I'd take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the logo and what it means, because it's a logo with meaning. So the outer envelope of the lines you see on the logo, that's the amount of carbon dioxide we still produce from fossil sources. And you'll notice every line on the logo actually is potentially politically sensitive. It's curved like that. It's not like that. So it doesn't look like most scenarios in the IPCC database, in the sense that it doesn't go off a cliff in 2020 the way emissions actually didn't do in 2020, but it acknowledges the reality that we are going to be curving the emissions down, and it's not going to be a handbrake turn. Some colleagues may disagree with that and say, no, we've got to try harder and pull the handbrake harder, but this is the situation we're in, and one could argue that the relevance of Oxford Net Zero gets ever greater as it proves ever harder to turn that overall carbon dioxide production that we're generating, pulling it down. The innermost section of the logo, the light blue, that's what's going into the atmosphere. And you'll notice that to start with, it's the same as the outer envelope, because we're putting it all in the atmosphere at the moment. And you'll notice, though, that gets pulled down faster, so it's sort of this shape. And that's because it's acknowledging the fact that the longer we delay pulling down what we emit in the atmosphere, the harder we're going to have to pull it down in the future, which is a really important message to get across to people. And then the central wedge, which I would have liked to have been green, but it didn't really go with our designer's color scale. So you have to sort of, imagine it green. But that's because we can't pull down, to start with, we can't pull down the amount we put in the atmosphere fast enough by just reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we generate. And so we have to supplement what we generate with capturing carbon dioxide using nature, which Aline will be talking to you about, and storing it back in the biosphere, restoring the biosphere to complement our efforts to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we produce. Finally, there's the more controversial black wedge, which acknowledges that there are limits to how much carbon dioxide we can put in the biosphere. And even with that carbon dioxide restoration of restoring carbon to the biosphere, we're still going to generate too much CO2, more than we can afford to dump in the atmosphere. And that dark blue wedge is what's going to have to go back underground. That's the geological storage component, which Tom will be talking to you about shortly. So that's the essence of the Oxford Net Zero logo. And it shows you, if you take any pathway to net zero, it's going to look a bit like that. And that was the kind of the point of the logo, that it sort of captures the diversity of different pathways there down to their essence. It's wonderful to welcome the Vice-Chancellor to open Oxford Net Zero's showcase event. So you no longer need hear me flanneling and pedaling like a duck and looking anxiously out the door to see whether anybody's about to arrive. And by the way, just to finish off the anecdote from earlier, I'm sorry I forgot your birthday in 2014.
But I'm absolutely delighted to be here because, as you know, I'm a great champion of the work that you do, and indeed the work that others not in the room do across this extraordinary collegiate university in the space of climate and, of course, biodiversity and all the aspects related to that. But more on that momentarily. But just a huge congratulations. It looks like you've got a fantastic itinerary for the day, so it's wonderful just to take time out, stop and reflect on just the success that has been, but also to challenge yourselves to think what more you can do going forward and what you need. And again, I'm sure Myles will let me know that in terms of what you need going forward to support your endeavours. Obviously, this was formulated several years ago because of a new research fund that the university created, the Strategic Research Fund. So credit and gratitude to Patrick Grant. I'm not sure if he's in the audience. I know that he'll probably be here at some point today, for having the vision to set up that fund. And the purpose of that fund was to seed new initiatives, new ideas, and particularly to try and get people to draw from the extraordinary interdisciplinary strength across this university to do something special and something at pace and with impact. And my goodness, you couldn't have been a better example of that. You were one of the early ones that received, I think it was 1.6 million. And in this first period of your growth, it's staggering. You've leveraged another 26 million pounds on top of that. That is absolutely fantastic, and huge kudos and credit to you all for that effort. It just shows what latent capacity was there, and it just needed that little spark of funding to drive. So notwithstanding what you're doing and the importance of the work that you're doing, this is a really great, I think, lesson and illustration for us as to just the importance of, again, making sure we have pots of money that can help seed initiatives like this, because it's you're really trailblazing in terms of how that fund can help support. So really well done on all that. You've also done a lot in terms of getting your tendrils out there. I think one of the challenges often that we have as a collegiate university when you've got extraordinary depth and breadth, and I have to say coming into this role several years ago, I knew bits about obviously the climate space because of being married to Myles and my own latent interest in it. But with the bird's eye view that I have, there really are only a few areas in the university. Of course, we're brilliant at everything, and that goes without saying, and well done again. We're QS Europe #1, and obviously Times Higher. Even Time Magazine have us as the top university in the world. So you're knocking it out the park in all the sort of ways that we get judged on. But the trick of the place, and of course the secret sauce, is how do we take that depth of brilliance in all these different subject areas that we have across our great 4/5 divisions and pull together and galvanise ourselves around particular goals that we want to achieve. And it is a fact, and I'm not being disrespectful to other brilliant areas in the university, that there are just a couple of areas I'd say that we've got extraordinary depth and breadth across the entire collegiate university, and the climate and sort of biodiversity area is one of those areas. I'd say AI actually is another one that we're recognising. Actually, we're really, really extraordinarily powerful in depth and breadth in there. So the challenge that you have, and it's not an easy one, is how do you galvanise such enormity of expertise and be goal-directed, because we need the solutions quick, and nobody else is stepping up to do it. And that's why I've been, trying to champion for you from from the sidelines, because I really see it as a responsibility of a global university like us to use the privileged position we're in, where we're not subject to annual shareholder returns, we're not subject to electoral cycles, we have a freedom, we work naturally across geographical spaces, we can take the long game and the long view. You know, we've got so many examples in this institution where questions have been resolved because we've stuck at it for 20, 25 years. So that's what and why you need research-intensive universities, because nobody else, frankly, can do that. And we're the last place standing to take on the problems that need a sustained effort. But in this context, there's a sort of need to get things done sooner. And that's why I've been really supportive of trying to say, let's get you all together and let's think about what we could actually, if we still, alongside our individual curiosity-led research, and alongside the curiosity that you enjoy as a principal investigator with your own research teams, if we actually just curated ourselves a bit together, what could we actually solve in a 0 to 5, 5 to 10 years? And that's the work that many of you have been involved with in terms of the stakeholder engagement work. Very grateful to Heidi Hansenberg, who'll speak a bit later, in terms of helping to convene that. And I'm excited to see what's going to come, because then that can map onto the development campaign, that can map onto resources that I can go out and help get for you, so that we can really step up to the world and say, not only are we going to continue doing the brilliant work that you've been doing as part of this Net Zero Institute and the other work that you do, but we are going to institutionally step into a space that nobody else in the public and private sector really are doing at scale, and we're actually going to take on, and we're going to declare that we're going to try and, in 0 to 5, 5 to 10, solve X, Y, and Z. And I'm excited to see what you're coming up with, and I'm excited to support you in that mission. So that's just sort of more broadly, you know, my passion for this area, which is why I'm very keen to be here today. But just in terms of that reach and that globalization and socialization, which is all part of what we can do also, particularly geopolitically at a time when others are saying there's no such thing as climate change, it's all a big hoax, it's really important that we stand up and we're very vocal about the fact that, no, there really is a climate problem and we do need to do something about it. And we won't shy away from standing up and making that statement. But we need to also work with partners. So really thrilled to see how well the Net Zero Institute has, again, through a couple of people I just want to shout out, Dr. Jessica Omukuti and Dr. Javier Bazan. They're working with the Strathmore University in Kenya. So again, not just thinking about the partnerships and socialising and making sure that everybody, particularly in places that are more affected by climate than, say, here, how we can lead with partnership, how we can make sure that we build critical mass and capacity building in other places that are more directly affected, but how can we do that in a just and equitable way? So I've been really pleased to read and see how well those programs are going and how much your tendrils have gone out there to not only get that critical mass of other partners that can, again, stand firm and take on this challenge, but we can build capacity building and we can have the humility to go to places that are more affected than we are experiencing, notwithstanding all this rain recently, and listen and learn and make sure that we're actually delivering and serving the people that are more affected by that. Your net zero tracker, I mean, what a great success that has been past couple of years. I mean, it's a citizen science project. It's phenomenal. This is why it won one of my Vice-Chancellor's awards last year, because of just the impact it had. So it brings together, again, a really important tool that is serving the broader global community. It is having impact, but it's drawing in. And it's importantly getting society and the people who are not in this room and the people who are not sitting in universities to, one, be made aware that there is still a climate problem, to join us and know that they can also play a part, and then to get excited about, you know, the contribution they can make and the science and what they're learning on it. And it's really pleasing to see how many of those people broadly from the Citizen Science Project have then gone on and continued in areas and careers that they wouldn't have gone into had they not had that exposure to the net zero tracker. So it's another different type of impact, but it couldn't be more important than now for us to be, as I've said in my oration this year, we've got to get out there sharing our stories, getting people excited about why you have research-intensive universities, why what we do matters, and how they can be a part of it, not just the joy of it, but they can help us. Because that's how we're going to make our place and our need relevant in maybe headwinds that might come, that might question the purpose of a research-intensive university and whether we really need it and whether actually society feels that's a benefit to them. So these projects are really important at multiple different levels, and it's wonderful to see just in 5 years how quick that has impacted. I do want to shout out to Dr. Steve Smith. I don't know if he's in the audience, but he's led both editions of the State of Carbon Dioxide Removal Report. This is an extraordinary, groundbreaking report, multi-institutional, looking at global trends for the crucial net part of the net zero phenomenon. It's been published in 23-24. It's had multiple articles spun out from it. And again, another wonderful example of making the science policy evident and relevant and having that enormous impact. I could go on, but I just want to share with you, I have the privilege of seeing lots of different places and going to lots of showcases and events. You have really moved at pace. It is really impressive to see what you've done at all these levels in just a short duration. So I can't wait to see what more is to come. I will do everything on my part to support you. As you know, we do have a campaign coming. Heidi will speak a bit later. Please think today and chat and challenge yourselves. Come up with ideas that you want us to help support you with, and we will do our best to meet that challenge. I will continue doing things like the Vice-Chancellor's Colloquium, where we're socialising the importance of climate, and we're teaching our undergraduates not just new skills, getting historians to learn maths and physicists to learn how to write. And so they're getting skilling up across the interdisciplinary divide, and they love it. We've just had to, in fact, double it, and now we've laid on a parallel course on AI. But what really was the hook was climate. And what that tells us is that all of our undergraduates, we've limited to undergraduates at the moment just for sheer space reasons, they want to learn, even if they're in a subject area that's nothing to do with this, they want to go out from this university empowered with some understanding and knowledge about the climate issue, because they know that no matter what job they're going to be or non-job, just as a parent or as a family member, as a partner, they're going to have to tackle this climate problem. And we can give them the skills and the confidence to have the conversations, to rebut nonsense that maybe is said in the media or by different other groups. And that is a really important mission. So again, we will continue to do that part of our education. Very keen to hear from you what more we could do in that regard. We would love to roll that out to all of our students. And again, all ideas welcome as to how we can do that at scale. But for today, have a great, great day. I'm going to stay just in about 10 to, and then I have to disappear off to another event on AI, actually. But I'm really pleased, and I'll no doubt Myles will tell me this evening when I get back late how it's all gone. And I just wish you very well. I thank you for everything that you do to support this great university in terms of your teaching and your research and this enormous impact. But just congratulations and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. And it's now a pleasure to introduce the first of our Net Zero Fellows who's speaking to us, Stuart Jenkins from School of Geography and the Environment and the Department of Physics. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you, Myles. Okay, so most of us know the headline definition of net zero. It's that the amount of CO2 that we emit, or the apples that we count positive, needs to be balanced by the amount of CO2 that we recapture from the atmosphere and store, the negative apples. But when it comes to fossil fuel emissions, the we in that sentence is quite important. Who are we talking about? And what precisely are we expecting them to do about it? Achieving net zero will ultimately mean billions of tons of CO2 being recaptured every year and pumped underground into storage. In equivalent terms, it's more than another ton of CO2 for every person on the planet alive today, every year being recaptured and stored underground. Behind me are the colourful logos of today's oil and gas sector. These are the key characters in extracting carbon from the geosphere and giving it to you where ultimately it ends up as an atmospheric emission. Funnily enough, they're also not particularly keen at the moment on developing this industry of returning CO2 back underground. So, why don't we regulate these companies to make them responsible for delivering the net in net zero? In Oxford Net Zero, I researched precisely these questions on the types of policies that we could apply to fossil fuel suppliers so that they come up with a credible CO2 waste management plan. In particular, I'll take you through a new policy that we've been championing in Oxford Net Zero called the carbon take-back obligation, which I see as a key component of the future of net zero in fossil fuels. Unfortunately, I can't tell you the most interesting stories about the carbon take-back obligation because, as always, they're under NDA. But I'll tell you the global story and you'll have to fill in the blanks for yourself. First, let me tell you where we are today. In black on this figure is the CO2 emissions in a 1.5 degree compatible scenario. It's an average that I made from scenarios in the most recent IPCC report. And you can see that we reached net zero in this scenario in the 2050s, late 2050s. But how do we do this? Well, as in the public narrative, the focus is on electrification, efficiency improvements, renewables deployment. We reduce our CO2 emissions by reducing our demand for fossil fuels. Put simply, we burn less, as is shown in red. But although these things form the bulk of our transition, even when we get this demand side roughly right, we're left with a large quantity of residual fossil fuels in society that we're going to continue to rely on throughout the second half of the 21st century. This is in things like aviation, shipping, and in certain industries and chemical feedstocks where we just don't have a reliable or reasonable alternative to fossil fuels. And for these residuals, we've ended up in quite a fragile arrangement today. The net in our net zero story is being passed towards the consumer or the last mile company, meaning that they're responsible for buying offsets. And the result is we're building an offset market which isn't really capable of managing the long-term challenge of fossil carbon. We're relying on mechanisms that could be non-additional or that could reverse through things like fire, land use change, weak governance practices, or just over a long period of time. That's, of course, not to say that they won't play absolutely vital roles in delivering net zero on their own. In green here, for example, I show the contribution of our forests, soils, oceans, and grasslands to achieving net zero. And they make a further contribution that's not even on this figure in passively pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere to help stabilize our temperatures in the second half of this century. But the point here is that these contributions are already assumed and already necessary as part of delivering temperature stabilization. And we can't go along with assuming that they're going to be available as counterweights to ongoing fossil fuel use. It's clear instead that we also need to build up the capacity for engineered CO2 storage. Governments understand this, and they are putting their money where their mouth is and sponsoring projects through subsidy or direct investment. This is positive, but it has its own limitations. Ultimately, a government's really going to be able to deliver 10 billion tonnes of CO2 storage every year at net zero? Probably not. And a tax and spend initiative is quite vulnerable to the politics of the day, as we're seeing. In summary, the world today looks something like this. We're making progress, and will continue to in many places, on reducing our demand for fossil fuels. But we're quite likely to have residual uses in a number of places. And we don't have a robust and scalable rule today that says, if you sell me the CO2, you're responsible for managing the waste that comes from that. If we know where we need to get to, and we're taking it seriously for fossil fuels, it means that any fossil fuel that's sold is being sold with a tagline of net zero compliance one day. And net zero compliance, although complicated in many contexts, for fossil fuels, you could boil down to something quite simple. The CO2, which results from producing and using the fuel, ultimately needs to be matched by CO2 somewhere else being permanently stored. That means capture at the point where the CO2 is produced, wherever it's possible, at industrial point sources with carbon capture and storage technologies. We do it there first because it's typically the cheapest and easiest starting point. Industry, after all, is static, large, and has relatively concentrated flue gases that we can capture from. And wherever that's not possible, we turn to atmospheric removal of carbon through technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and later direct air capture. And critically, whichever capture technology we rely on, we're relying on storage, which is going to be durable, monitored, and governed in the long term. Overwhelmingly, this points us towards geological storage in things like saline aquifers or depleted oil and gas reservoirs. And Tom will tell you more about that after me. For fossil fuel suppliers, there's an interesting market available here. In a net zero world, if we've established that fossil fuels aren't going to disappear, then we've also established that they stop being a commodity that all you're buying is their energy content. Imagine instead a fossil fuel becomes something like a bundled product. By buying the fossil fuel, you buy access to the energy, but along with it comes a contracted carbon management service to make sure that every tonne of CO2 is placed back underground. And there's also an obvious regulatory gap here. Governments already regulate so many different parts of our energy market today. We regulate things like fuel quality, product safety. We even limit profits in the energy sector. So why don't we regulate fossil fuels so that selling them requires that you've arranged for this waste disposal? Well, this is the basic premise of the carbon take-back obligation. If you sell the fossil fuel, you must ensure that an increasing fraction of the CO2 content that would result from its use is captured and permanently stored. In practice, fuel suppliers have a choice here. They can go out and deliver the CO2 storage for themselves, or, potentially more likely in many contexts, they contract this service out to a third party, a geological storage operator. They pay for a certificate that says, I stored CO2 on your behalf. That certificate allows extractors to go to government and prove compliance. Geological storage operators source their CO2 by going out into the market and working with CO2 capture plants to transport CO2 for storage to them and pay them for access to their CO2. And in doing so, you create a market. Critically, the obligation starts off small, and over time, you ratchet it up, introducing more and more expensive capture opportunities until one day, every ton of CO2 that's sold through the market in the form of a fossil fuel comes with a carbon storage certificate attached to it. And you might ask, well, why focus on regulating at the point of sale, Stuart, when there's industrial point sources and consumers? And of course, we also have policies that we need to work on to develop the willingness to capture and store CO2 with these industries as well. But the extractor has three particular important advantages to it. By targeting them, you naturally target the whole value chain below them. Two, you assign incentives for the extractor or importer which align with their true net zero bottleneck, which is access to the correct amount of CO2 storage. And three, you create a predictable market downstream where capturers know they're going to have somewhere to send their CO2. So, to close, I asked, why don't we regulate our fossil fuel suppliers to deliver the net in net zero? And I think jurisdictions are ultimately getting closer to recognising this as a key missed opportunity and trialling it for themselves. The carbon take-back obligation is just one policy blueprint, but it's practical and scalable and based on a number of other policies that exist in other markets today. A lot of policy making is, of course, very complex, and I'm sure that the final policy won't come out of the wash in exactly the way I've described it to you. But the underlying principles still need to ring true. If you want to sell a fossil fuel at net zero, you can't just sell me their energy content. You need to deliver permanent carbon disposal with it at a rising and eventually full coverage. This simple statement reframes the future of fossil fuels, and it centres their suppliers in building the CO2 storage system on which net zero will depend. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And now but I will just say one thing on your logos slide of the vast majority of the logos on that slide, you were quite correct, are not really doing anything about the net in net zero, with one small exception. You did have Oxy's logo on there, and since Steve is in the room, I just want to set the record straight. We do recognise that one fossil fuel company is leaning in very hard to the net in net zero, and kudos to Oxy for doing that. But sorry, apologies for that, Stuart, but over to Tom to talk about the how we get rid of carbon dioxide geologically, having emphasised the scale of the challenge in front of us.
Great. Thanks, Myles. This is me about a year ago. It's 47 degrees Celsius. Around me are tunnels that stretch into complete darkness. There's 1.5 kilometres of rock above my head, and above that is the North Sea. I'm going to explain why I was there and why this place matters. So, as we've just heard from Stuart and from Myles, we're going to need to deal with billions of tons of CO2 emissions from ongoing industries. And that's going to be really challenging. Now, I think when a lot of people think of that process, as Myles already alluded to, I think they think of trees and nature doing a lot of that offsetting work. And whilst this is absolutely vital, and Aline is going to talk about this later, it cannot bear the burden alone, and it's already under stress from climate change. And so we're going to need something quite different. We're going to need this. We're going to need industry, carbon capture, and permanent geological storage. So I'm a geophysicist. I work on studying the Earth's subsurface to solve problems related to this industry, to work out how to make sure that CO2 stored geologically deep underground stays there for a very, very long time. Explaining one of the most fascinating parts of my job, right now at least, starts here though, at the surface. So this is the Bolby Mine. It's a relatively unassuming industrial site on the North Yorkshire coast here in the UK. But nothing really can prepare you for what's underneath this place. So since the 1960s, generations of miners have been extracting mineral fertilizer from deep underground, from thick layers of salts over a kilometre below the surface. They've excavated tunnels that lead tens of kilometres out underneath the coast in the North Sea. And there are now, through the network of tunnels, thousands of kilometres of tunnels, all interconnected, covering a vast area of rock. These rocks and the salts here extend out across the North Sea into the same areas where CO2 storage is being developed right now in the UK, in the southern North Sea and beyond. Beneath those salts are sandstones. These are porous rocks filled with microscopic little bubbles and spaces that you can think of as acting a lot like a sponge. These sandstones are the same kinds of rocks that once held for millions of years oil and gas, and now we're getting them to store CO2 instead. I think when lots of people think of geological CO2 storage, if they don't know about it already, would imagine sort of pumping CO2 gas into big caves underground. And that's just not what's happening here. What we're actually doing is injecting liquid or very dense supercritical CO2 into the sandstones, filling them up and it getting absorbed like water into a sponge, and then it's stopped being propagating up to the surface, going up vertically, by impermeable rocks, thick layers of impermeable rocks, like salts above the sandstones. That way, the CO2 will stay trapped underground over geological timescales, just like it was for oil and gas. So hearing this, I think it's quite reasonable to ask, how do we know that this works? And the thing is, geological carbon storage really isn't new. So since the 1970s, the oil and gas industry have been injecting large quantities of CO2 into the subsurface. And for around 3 decades now, there have been dedicated permanent geological CO2 storage projects operating around the world, some of which are storing millions of tons of CO2 every year. We don't really think about that most of the time, but across all of these early projects, a lot of those common questions and common worries have been answered. So far from these projects, there has never been a leak of CO2 to the surface, and there have never been any earthquakes that anyone has felt that has resulted from that CO2 injection. The problem isn't whether this works, it's about scaling it up to vastly more than what it's doing right now and making sure that that's done safely. And that's where my work comes in. So I work on monitoring, on listening to the Earth and as it responds to what we do to it. So as we inject CO2, the rocks move by tiny amounts, fractions of a millimeter. And as they move, they make noise. These are tiny earthquakes, you can think of them like, that can tell us a lot about how these rocks are behaving. These are far too small for anyone to feel, these events, but not small enough for my instruments to detect. So what I'm doing deep underground in this really unique environment is deploying sensors and listening for these signals to better understand how fractures behave in these salts, how fluids can move through these environments, through these rocks, and to better characterize faults, geological faults, and their risks that they pose on CO2 storage. Doing this in this really unique, deep environment is extraordinary and incredibly rare. We get to walk through massive amounts of rocks that would otherwise be buried kilometers deep and uncover a bunch of the uncertainty that would otherwise be clouding our view. So this is a really extraordinary place to do work. The thing is, it's not just about better science, it's about better decisions. So this work that I do relates to the way that we regulate CO2 storage, the way that we decide what's acceptable, what's safe, and what to do if something goes wrong. Now, for this kind of work doesn't happen in isolation. It has to come at the intersection of science, of regulation, of industry, of governance, and of public trust. And that kind of intersected work is exactly what Oxford Net Zero was set up to do. And it's what makes Oxford Net Zero really unusual and really special place to do work. The thing is, the reason why that intersection is really important is because carbon storage is one of the industries where trust matters as much as the technology. Because if a project goes wrong, it won't just be that one storage site that we may lose. We could lose trust in the entire endeavor, and then we could lose public confidence and trust in one of the most vital tools that we need to stop climate change. And my work helps to make sure that that doesn't happen. So my fellowship at Oxford Net Zero allowed me to take this idea seriously. It gave me the space and time to really push the frontier of this underground science. It allowed me to apply for and win more funding to do early experiments, to set up now a global network of industry and academic experts trying to share the potential of this incredible place, and to really push this and to start the work on turning this environment into a global and national asset for energy transition research. So the science I work on really tries to make sure that that CO2 storage industry can expand safely, responsibly, and with that public trust. Like, the work that I do doesn't just study the Earth, it helps to make sure that the rocks beneath our feet will be there to help protect the climate above them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's really inspiring to see the work that everybody's doing. And now it's a pleasure to introduce Aline Soterroni, who's talking about the other aspect of net in net zero, storage of carbon in the biosphere and the related work we do around preserving the biosphere through the transition. Over to you, Aline.
Thank you, Myles. This is the last song of an extinct bird, the Kauai-o-o, a voice that has been silenced forever. And why does this matter for the net zero debate? Because birds are among our best forest gardeners. They spread seeds, pollinate plants, help forests grow and flourish, and healthy forests capture and store vast amounts of carbon. Nature, through forests, peatlands, mangroves, soils, oceans, absorb about half of our global carbon emissions. Half. Nature is doing an amazing job. Still, it is often taken for granted in climate conversations, but nature isn't a nice to have. Nature is our strongest ally against climate change. And in this climate-nature linkage, I am an unlikely ally. It was supposed to be a picture of me in front of a samauma, the tree of life. I'm an unlikely ally because I'm not a biologist, I'm not an ecologist, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a mathematician in the biology department. My tools are equations, coefficients, code. I use math to build scenarios and models that help understand complex systems, integrating climate, land, socio-economic aspects, policies into a single framework. Models are simplifications of reality, but they are powerful enough to reveal trade-offs, give insights, and guide better policies and decisions today. Powerful enough to help us imagine futures that are still worth fighting for. Achieving global net zero is one of those futures. And while it requires international coordination, climate action happens at national level, country by country. And depending on where you are in the world, the net zero debate looks different. In Brazil, my country, the fifth largest emitter, and home to an extraordinary diversity of life, including 60% of the Amazon rainforest, net zero is not primarily an energy problem. It is a land use problem, a deforestation problem, a governance problem, a biodiversity conservation problem, and ultimately, a people problem. Global models are too coarse to capture those nuances. And for more than a decade, I've been working on adapting global models to countries' realities, particularly to the Brazilian context. And as an Oxford Net Zero Fellow and also part of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, I've been working closely with Brazilian colleagues and Brazil's government to answer different questions like, what does a net zero pathway for Brazil look like? What climate pledges or NDC targets can Brazil realistically deliver? Or how much nature-based solutions could help achieving those targets? Here is the answer. Nearly 80% of Brazil's net zero pathways can be reached or achieved through nature-based solutions. Avoiding deforestation is the most important action, followed by restoration of degraded ecosystems. And I'm not talking about afforestation here. And when we asked the model to bridge the gap only with technologies including bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, net zero was not achieved in a cost-effective way. So the conclusion is clear. There is no net zero in Brazil without nature-based solutions. And why is Brazil's net zero pathway rooted in nature so important? Because, above all, it is a choice to protect the Amazon rainforest. Amazon is a critical ecosystem at risk of achieving a tipping point with devastating environmental, social, economic consequences, not only locally, but all over the world. Amazon stores hundreds of billion tons of carbon, an amount equivalent to nearly 20 years of our current global emissions. Now, imagine releasing all this carbon into the atmosphere. From a carbon perspective alone, net zero needs the Amazon. But it's not all about carbon. Protecting the Amazon is about life. The biome is home to 10% of our known species on Earth. And we are living a biodiversity crisis where species are disappearing at alarming rates, largely driven by deforestation. Many will vanish even before we know their names. Protecting the Amazon is about the multiple benefits the forest provides to our economies, our societies, and there is a direct link between health and balance, ecosystems, biodiversity, and those benefits. And I'll name only one benefit: water. Is there anything more vital to our life on Earth than water? Can we live without water? The Amazon flying rivers sustain rainfall regime, food production, food security, climate stability, and far beyond the forest. Protecting the Amazon is also about adaptation and and climate resilience for 47 million people, including over 2 million indigenous peoples, local communities from the region that are already on the front lines of climate change and biodiversity loss, despite contributing the least to those crises. Protecting nature, especially the Amazon, is essential for net zero. But more than that, it is a moral and an ethical imperative. Our future depends on both a stable climate and a living planet. The paradox is net zero needs nature, but on the other hand, nature also needs net zero. Climate change poses a significant threat to nature itself. The Amazon is more flammable and less resilient because of global warming. So we need technologies like the ones presented by Tom and Stuart to become affordable and scalable as soon as possible. But at the same time, we cannot afford to lose nature. That's why I'm pushing the research frontier to a new generation of integrated assessment models that are transparent rather than black boxes, co-created and meaningful at local level, but more importantly, that put nature at the heart of our climate debate. Treat nature as a core pillar of our climate action. The idea is simple but profound. To have tools and debates like this one we are having today reflect that climate change and biodiversity loss are two sides of the same coin and must be addressed together. Because solutions or net zero pathways that compromise nature also compromise the future of humanity. And the bottom line here is there is no humanity without nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aline. And one of the great achievements, I think, of Oxford Net Zero is only quite recently the work of Aline and Erica supporting the foundation of the Tropical Forests Forever facility in COP30 in Belém. I think that was a really fantastic achievement, all the work you did in support of that. And one of the things I think Oxford Net Zero should be thinking hard about going forwards is, how do we actually get the resources coming into the TFFF so as to make sure that it can deliver what it needs to deliver, as you so clearly put it.
I'm delighted to introduce Jessica Omukuti, who you can see on screen. Now, Jessica was all lined up to be with us in person, but sadly can't make it due to small children ill at home. But we're delighted, Jessica, that you can join us online and still present to us. So over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to make it. And I have a very contagious infection. And so we thought it would probably be better if I stayed at home and did this and be online. I hope it goes as well as I imagined it would go. And that's a really good cue to get into the presentation itself. So I would like to talk to you today about net zero in the global south. And I'll start by just reflecting. There comes a time when an idea moves from being an abstract concept to one that is relatable, that is used by people in their everyday lives, and it shapes how people think and act. And a very good example is flattening the curve. Flattening the curve was a term that I think that became had that shift from abstract to relatable in around 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic. Before 2020, flattening the curve was a term that was used mostly by epidemiologists. mostly to talk about how to reduce the spread of infections or to reduce the spread of diseases and how to ensure that they were able to maintain healthcare facility capacity. But during the pandemic in around 2020, we saw flattening the curve become a very public-facing policy governing instrument that was used to mostly, justify lockdowns, conduct hospital planning, but also to incentivize behavior change. And I remember sitting in my living room, listening to Boris Johnson repeatedly say, protect the NHS, flatten the curve. And I listened to that so many times until flattening the curve became a term that I would use in my everyday vocabulary. I remember feeling really smart back then. I don't use it anymore though, but it was a really smart time of my life, even though it was quite sad. A similar term that went through the same transition and at around the same time was the term net zero. And so net zero before about around 2020, 2021. So before 2020, net zero was a term that was mostly used by climate scientists to refer to the balance that was needed to happen in the atmosphere or the climate system broadly to achieve a balance that would limit warming to a certain threshold. But around 2020, 2021, and that was before, during, and after the COP26 in Glasgow, if you remember, net zero became a term that was used by governments, corporates, but also everyday citizens to talk about what they could do to contribute towards climate action. And net zero became a term that was a goal, a slogan, but also a benchmark. And it was an interesting time. However, what became a global, a very common term was also not really a term that was understood in terms of its origins. And so people didn't stop to ask, whose understanding is it? What do we mean by net zero or global net zero? And where did this term or the meaning come from? My team and I realized that what we understood as net zero or even global net zero was a term that was defined in boardrooms, policy spaces and research institutions, much like this one, in Europe and North America, which is largely the global north. And this understanding of global net zero made assumptions about the role of the global south in achieving, in contributing towards global net zero. It made assumptions about the willingness and capacity and motivation of the global south in contributing towards net zero. It assumed that the global south was a monolith, very much homogeneous, and that they would just, get along with whatever we understood net zero to be. We decided to design a portfolio of research that would look into what net zero meant in the global south, and what it would take for the global south to contribute to the global goal of net zero. And we've done a lot of work on projects such as carbon dioxide removal. We've done work on carbon markets. We've done work on governance of net zero generally by governments, but also by the private sector. And one project I'd like to highlight is one that's been funded by Axelsson. And the goal of this project was to understand whether corporates in developing countries, in the global south broadly, are decarbonizing or implementing net zero, what's motivating them, but also what's slowing them down. And we focused on 3 countries, that's Mexico, Kenya, and India, because they are economic powerhouses in their respective regions. but also we decided to narrow down a bit and focus on two sectors, and that's the food and beverage sector and the buildings and construction sector, mostly because they are high emitting sectors, but also high growth sectors in their respective countries, but also in the regions generally. And we've spoken to over 100 companies across these three countries. And what we found was very interesting. We did not find resistance to net zero. We found that companies within the two sectors in the three countries are already reducing their emissions. We found that companies are manufacturing low carbon cement to reduce the embodied carbon in buildings. We also found that companies are recycling their packaging and working directly with farmers to reduce the carbon footprint of their products. And this is interesting because at first we were finding that there's no resistance to net zero is a good thing. We realized that the Global South will contribute to net zero. But then when we went a bit further, we found that there's different motivations for companies in each of these countries in engaging in net zero. For example, in Kenya, companies did not decarbonize because they felt a moral responsibility for the emissions they produced, even though they're some of the highest emitting companies or the highest emitting sectors at the national level. The companies are decarbonizing because they recognize that there is a cost efficiency, there's efficiency gains to be made from decarbonization. In Mexico, we found that companies are motivated to decarbonize mostly because of the national level commitments and guidelines that have been put in place by companies. And decarbonization by large conglomerates in Mexico is generating shifts and effects downstream within the smaller companies. And so we're seeing a trickle-down effect in decarbonization. And what we're learning is that these countries, even from just those two countries, they're not homogeneous at all. Even though the goal is the same, the outcome is the same, we're finding that the motivations, the approaches are quite different in how the private sector decides to decarbonize. The effects of national level regulations and policies is quite different in these two countries. For the next 5 years, we're hoping to continue along the same agenda to demystify what net zero means in the Global South. And we're excited about understanding particularly what energy transitions mean in the Global South, because we know that at the core of transitions in Global South countries is the energy transition journey. And we've seen a very huge level of investments in energy transitions in these countries. For example, in Sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen a lot of resources, investments, technical capacity go into incentivizing transitions in energy. But then we know very little about how energy transitions happen. We don't know why transitions stall or reverse. We don't know how they start. We do know the end goal, where it's electrification or use of energy or installed capacity, but we don't know how electrification starts or stalls or reverses in different contexts. And we know that energy transitions are they're not linear, they're quite messy, and they're very contested in different areas or regions, and affected by issues such as politics, power, and everyday practices. And so in understanding what energy transitions mean, we will be looking at what net zero actually means in developing countries. And this work is about building a much deeper and grounded understanding of net zero in the Global South. And this is important because without it, net zero will continue looking like a concept that is designed elsewhere and implemented in the Global South, which is not right, which is not ideal, and also not practical. And so a genuinely global understanding of net zero is one that is shaped by the experiences, the motivations, the capacities of communities, countries, stakeholders, including corporates in the global south. And this understanding has to be rooted in the realities of these places, because the future of climate action will not be decided elsewhere, but in the context that these transitions happen. And so the question is not whether the global south is willing to participate or to contribute towards net zero. It's mostly a question of whether the global conversation is ready to listen to what the global south has to offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We wish you and your family a quick recovery, so we hope to see you soon in person. Just a reminder to all of you that even though you can't meet Jessica in person today, you can check the QR codes at the back, or you can find Jessica on the Oxford Net Zero and Oxford University web pages and get in touch with her. So thank you, Jessica. Next up is Selam Abebe, our Oxford Net Zero Fellow in Law.
Hi. So I'm Selam. So I thought this picture could be clearer, maybe the lights, yeah. So I thought this picture would help me also explain what I do, because sometimes spending a lot of time on the negotiations is challenging, but it also has its benefits. So especially on how words are framed, right? So when how Nate became the thing. So this sometimes from the negotiation rooms, it ends up in a huddle where you're actually testing words that end up going to a decision. So sometimes that's a challenge, but that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to join Oxford, to have that academic insight, the theory, and to bring that science to the practice that I enjoy working on. So on the left at that time was the Grenada minister. Now he is the ES of the UNFCCC. So this was one of the longest run over COP25, where we're trying to save the COP with a proposal that could advance the rulemaking under the Paris Agreement. So this was COP25. But COP25, some do criticize it, saying that LACE has been achieved, but there was some achievements on rule development, and in particular to net zero. Three things come to my mind. The first is some government people might not know about it, but most policymakers that are on top do recognize that word. And there are guidance that are part of the climate regime process. So international law has provided a clarity around a general guidance around what net zero means. So the first anchoring was 10 years ago when we adopted the Paris Agreement. So it talks about long-term mitigation trajectories. So countries need to think about long-term mitigation trajectories. They need to think about reaching the limits, the global peaking, as soon as possible for some, and taking into account it would take longer for developing countries. Then it also spoke about the elements that we just discussed, rapid reductions and achieving the balance between removals and sinks. So that guidance of what net zero means was embedded in the treaty itself. But then there were a few things that were not clear, right? So this is also something that I'm thinking about, and something we also need to think about is, okay, that general guidance is there, but how do we actually make it ambitious? How do we make it credible? And how do we aggregate it, right? So are we trying to achieve something? So the first is on the scope, and the scope it covers. The second is how do we address residual emissions? The removal quality, as we've been discussing this morning, and then the accounting choices. So this is something that countries have continued to think about and need to think about, and a newer lens that I would present a bit later. So the second point from the Paris Agreement, we evolved. Yes, countries said we need to submit our long-term emission reduction strategies, and there was further guidance. So countries would now know that countries need to submit their long-term strategies. So that's the the process or the vehicle of how we get to net zero. So there is a requirement from international law where countries are requested to submit long-term strategies. And these long-term strategies are the strategies where countries communicate how they understand net zero, how they would achieve net zero, and then the sectors they would define it. So that process is there, and around 80 countries have submitted long-term strategies. So I would argue that we need to keep with the net zero term, but really try to clarify what could be done, including defining the parameters to make it better. And the second important discussion following from Jessica's point was, okay, we countries develop long-term strategies, but then how does that reflect the different contexts of countries, different realities of countries? So that's the actual term net zero came in the decision under the UNFCCC process at COP28. So it was the COP presidency at that time introduced long-term strategies should achieve net zero. At that point, the African Group proposal, so one of the areas I work on is supporting the negotiations under the UNFCCC space, is really to say, okay, how do we understand net zero strategies? And then that was the proposal led towards just transitions to net zero emission. So whenever you type transitions now, it would be auto-corrected, but that's part of a decision. So there is no singular transition to net zero. So there are multiple transitions. So that further guidance of who defines transition was also to some extent reflected for the first time at COP26. So we got that term, net zero, embedded in our climate regime, and then there is plurality of the transitions embedded in decisions. So this is expected that this would guide countries in communication of their long-term strategies or net zero strategies. And as per that, for example, India has submitted 2070 to be the year where they would reach that net zero, while many others have said 2050. But that didn't really end there. It was important, and this transitioning me back to the work with Oxford Net Zero, is really to think about how do we understand transitions? How do we understand transitions, especially from developing countries' perspective, where priorities are sustainable development, real realities of countries are eradicating poverty? How do we understand that? So, and interestingly, the COP after COP26 was COP27. It was an African COP. So working with the Egyptian presidency, what we proposed was we need to think about transition pathways to net zero. So now the discussion has been, we see net zero transitions from emission reduction perspective, but there has to be more to it. So transition needs to be defined. Of course, the first priority should be emission reduction, but the second could be how do we invest on resilience and what's the contribution of that to net zero? And the third would be the transitioning of our financial sectors. How do we transition financial sectors to support low emission projects, but while taking into account that there could be sustainable development needs? So that led to the discussion around establishing the work program on just transition pathways. So this is another interesting picture where, of course, after the official preliminary, some texts are being tested, and we ended up establishing just transition pathways. So that pathway is now framed not only around emission, but it's around temperature goal, the emission reduction, sustainable development, addressing poverty eradication. And then it spans across energy, socio-economic, workforce, of course, and then bringing social protection, I think has been said earlier, so it needs to look into that account as well. So finally, so of course I said, countries, at least governments, need to understand what net zero means, because they have been having this decision for the last 10 years. They have been given this guidance. They know the modality of how they need to communicate their net zero, but what is missing is the question. What's missing is a framework, a common framework that could actually help us in raising ambition, credibility, aggregated so that we know where we're going with this. But there are a few challenges, right? The first is the geopolitical fragmentation. We are in a geopolitical time where multilateralism is being questioned and countries are questioning even the truth of climate change itself. So how do we address that is the first question. The second is net zero is beyond emissions. I want to make that point. Maybe a point that I want to leave with is it's beyond emissions. It's really now coming into other sectors where net zero is also a component of value chain definition. So how net zero is reached would depend on our industrial policy, trade policy, and so on. The third is the different competing clubs, or we have heard the middle powers narrative now, where countries of a few with common principles would need to do something to address that. So the final proposal is we need to change how we see the question of net zero. And the proposal is we need to see it through a lens of cooperation. And that cooperation needs to go beyond the UNFCCC. So it's not only the climate change that would answer this question, but it's beyond the UNFCCC where we need to bring the trade element, recognize development priorities of countries, not only developing countries, but developed countries' economic security is something that we need to ensure, and we need to see through that lens, including a very recent example is the EU-India trade deal, where EU waived the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment, for a return to the 500 million finance provision. So India would now work around CBAM, the border adjustments, because they have now this finance provision given. So it's now beyond the climate discussion. So that will be something what I will be thinking about next. So really to see net zero beyond emissions, beyond the UNFCCC space, and really linking it to trade, industrial policy, and sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you, Selam. Great example, and credit to you for being so involved in the international negotiation space through the African group. Last but not least, I'm delighted to welcome Kaya Axelsson, our Oxford Net Zero Fellow on Policy and Engagement, but really focused very much on business. So over to you, Kaya.
This mic? Yeah. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, good. Following on from Selam, I am going to talk about a story related to negotiations. Selam does the big dog negotiations, but back in the day before Oxford Net Zero started, when I was the student union vice president representing students' concerns on climate, I myself found myself in the midst of a different kind of negotiation. I have to say that being the first fellow and then having to follow all the other fellows today is really quite the challenge. We have just such an incredible breadth, which I hope you've all seen today, but also a depth of disciplined research, challenging questions. I think our little debate on stage really typifies the culture we've developed at Oxford Net Zero around challenging each other's ideas, representing different perspectives, whether it be the perspective of physics, of nature, of the economy, of social science. And I think that was what I was trying to do back in 2019 when I was standing on a frozen lawn with students who had camped out in front of one of the university's biggest and most well-endowed colleges. And they'd been camping there for 2.5 weeks. And I think at that point, the Vice-Chancellor was concerned about hypothermia. And it was my job to figure out how to get students off the lawn, but more importantly, how to meet their demands, which were to align the university to a credible definition of net zero, including our investments, our own policies, our strategies. And the university was willing to play ball. We had some of the folks in this room really on our side. I mean, it's always been an alliance between students and climate scientists on this matter. There's always been a very clear and strong commitment that comes out of the classroom and comes out of that dialogue. But we had one problem. We had papers on the definition of net zero, but when I was trying to write a policy with the university staff, it was clear that there was no internationally agreed definition of net zero for an organization. So we didn't let that bother us. We don't take no for an answer at Oxford Net Zero, or what would have become Oxford Net Zero. We said to the university, why don't you help us figure this out? And we put together a research bid, and we took some of that nice COVID money that we got off of being a great innovator on the medical side of what we do at this university, and we were able to create an entire research program around this problem. And it turned out that it wasn't just Steve and Sam and Myles and Cameron and those of us that got together to start Net Zero who were trying to ask this question of how do you do Net Zero and get it right. It was the world's. Nigel Topping, who is here with us today, was asking that question in the highest levels of business. We had cities, states, and region coalitions that were springing up around this tricky definition. And it was exactly the time, with the UK hosting the COP presidency, for us to come together around a common minimum criteria. And universities do one thing very well. We don't always get the facts perfectly. We don't always have the answers. We don't always communicate perfectly, but we do convene very well. And we ask hard questions, and we pursue them with integrity. And so what we were able to offer that ecosystem and that movement in that moment was just a convening space. And then we became vessels for the answer. And I'd like to think that we continue to do that as the definition of net zero and even the title or the framing or the leverage points evolve. But it was a time of, as kind of Solitaire pointed out earlier, a time of optimism, a time of the Greta effect. There's a statistically significant effect of the school strike movements and carbon credit purchases. This is a classic Overton-Windhill issue. I'm sure Greta herself would not be particularly pleased with that because she's rather skeptical of sort of market reforms, but I think that that shows the power of movements, that finance flows when movements grow. And at the time, we also had CEOs jumping up on stage and saying, yep, I want to be on stage. I want to be on stage with Nigel. I want to be on stage with Alex Sharma. And I want to be seen to be doing the right thing. So the levers that we had to play with at that time are not the levers that we have today. But the student's question that was posed on that frozen lawn is still something that we can pursue and will pursue in the halls of power. So what does it mean to be a net zero aligned organization? What does it mean to be a net zero aligned business? There are the businesses that are going brown to green, the big businesses, and then there are the green innovators. So the Race to Zero campaign that Nigel and the team started with the UN backing and with such an incredible effort of global movement effort had two sides to it. It had the side that was just thinking about how organizations could shift their strategies, but it also had this other side focused on innovation. And that was actually empirically grounded. It's ultimately Tim Lenton and the system thinkers. We've got Cameron in the room, the sensitive intervention point guys who want to do a little bit of high impact stuff that's really well strategized for an outsized impact. And the governance thinkers, perhaps your Tom Hales might be in this category, people who understand the incremental, iterative governance process that is going to get us to net zero through a collective of individual targets. And my research now, my thesis, which as all of you know, I've been working on for quite some time while trying to develop a research and action program with Oxford Net Zero, is exploring that tension between those two sides. And when I go to businesses, and now I've had the privilege working with all of you to engage hundreds of businesses, we find that they don't see a tension between those sides. Sometimes the tension plays off in terms of where they should spend their money, but they see them as kind of two parts of a complete whole of what it means to get my organization to net zero and contribute to global net zero. So what's the problem then? We've got all this momentum. We've asked the right questions. We're starting to get clear answers. Businesses are starting to figure out their plans. Well, engagement is hard. And when we talked to businesses, we would ask three things. We would ask, how are your products shifting? We would ask, how are your policies shifting? How's your policy engagement shifting? And we would ask, how are you using the power of your portfolio of finance? But moreover, we were also asking kind of the governance questions. We were asking, I like to score net zero commitments on a nice acronym you can maybe remember around a dinner table. Short-term targets, that's the S, full coverage of all greenhouse gases and scopes, a clear and outlined plan with careful considerations on how much and how they're offsetting, a robust reporting mechanism, and equity. And what we found, actually, thanks to the Net Zero Tracker, is that only about 250 companies, that's around 6 or 7% of those Forbes 2000 list, are meeting those minimum criteria. A lot of them, as Soli explained, are still trying to figure out what net zero means. So that means our job is not done. Our job is now to put the definitions of net zero into policy and practice, and to write the international standards that can help us get there in a comparable and fair way. So I continued to do my research. We weren't going to just write policy and engage without talking to companies. We talked to companies in every sector, the really high ambition consumer goods companies you might think of when you think of Net Zero Line Company, and the fossil fuel companies like the ones that Stuart works with. And I had one particular afternoon which was a real turning point for me. I had an opportunity to sit down in front of a small audience with the CEO of Shell. And I was promised as like the kind of respectable activist, like someone who wouldn't shout at him but would push him. I like to play that role. We had a really frank discussion. I thought he was really honest with me. I was not expecting him to be so honest with me. But when I asked him, how are you going to align your products to net zero? Will there be a geological fraction of your oil and gas that you're selling? He said no, not if the money's not there. When I asked him, how are you going to align your portfolio of finance to net zero? He said, I'll let the investors tell us. And when I asked him, how is your policy engagement aligning to your target and your strategy and your plan? His team said, carbon pricing? That would be nice. That would be nice. But how? I went away from that day shaking. It was actually a really good thing that Myles was there to give me a hug, because I was so mad, I practically couldn't think for the next 2 days. Luckily, I have an amazing team, and Alexis was there, and Matilda had just joined us, and we went back to the drawing board. We said, targets and pathways and reduction plans are not enough. It's time for us to redefine net zero. So we thought about those 3 areas where the Shell CEO had fallen short. And we thought, actually, it's not just his fault. We haven't really asked the world about their policy engagement, their portfolio of climate finance, or their product alignment to net zero. So we wrote a paper called Leveraging Your Spheres of Influence, how you can align your policy engagement, your products, and your portfolio of climate finance to net zero. And it kind of went viral, thanks to Soli's help and a helpful HBR editor. Now we're working with companies all around the world to not just consider what footprint they're going to leave behind, but also what their legacy will be in terms of contributing to the global net zero picture. And then we had to go back to the drawing board and convince all of our friends in the international standards system that they also should include that in the definition of net zero. And if you've ever been a part of an international standard organization negotiation meeting, it's like an Athenian arena without the armor, and like 100 of the world's best and most fractious experts from civil society, you've got your far greens, industry, you've definitely got your oil and gas, and then member organizations from every national standards body that they could bring into the process. And ISO has 169 different international standards bodies. So you tell them that their definition of net zero that they've been operating from, which we're trying to write a standard on for the last 3 years, is incorrect, and they absolutely flip out. It's taken me probably 2.5 years to bring a new kind of concept of net zero into this standard that addresses the systemic levers as well as the carbon reduction measures. And I can't tell you what's going to be in the standard yet, because just like Stuart has NDAs, I have a commitment to governance. But what I can say is that it has been an awesome, dialogic, agonistic process that really, I think, exemplifies what Alexis was saying about what we need to do in terms of bringing back democracy into the climate dialogue. Instead of seeing companies as the kind of enemies or as the organizations that were constantly falling short in the way I thought of them when I first started this job, honestly, I see companies as thought leaders who can help me understand how I get from point A to point B. When I talk to some of the people who I've developed relationships with in the international standards process, they tell me, I understand where you want to go, you just can't write it that way. And over maybe years of iteration, we get to a position that works with their practicalities and their real-world challenges in terms of how they implement the standards, and works with my ambition that comes from deeply a perspective and commitment to science. And so when I turn back and think about those frozen students who've probably all graduated and are happily on to their next careers at this point, I like to think that within the next year, as the international standards are published, I'll have an answer for them. And it's really thanks to all of you and to every single one of the researchers and fellows and directors and development support from the university that has made it possible for us to have an answer for those students. So my ask to you all is, when those standards come out, please help us get them into the hands of policy and practice so that the definition of net zero can go from a frozen lawn to a global movement. Thank you.
And that is also the end of our morning together. That just leaves me to thank you all for, I know you have busy schedules, so thank you all for spending time with us. We are 5 years old. We have aspirations to become 10 years old, so I hope you can continue your engagement with Oxford Net Zero. We are very keen on this is a network, this is an institute, this is a community. So very keen on your wisdom, on your network, on your contacts, on your funding, if you're that way inclined, on just engaging with us and sharing this important topic with us. So thank you all very much. There's lunch somewhere out there, somewhere. I hope you can stay for that as well. Thanks, everybody.